The summer of 1887 came down like a hammer on the town of Elhorn Ridge. Heat shimmered off the dry plains, and the sky stretched wide and pitiless, a sheet of brass above the cracked earth. Folks moved slower this time of year, their boots dragging through dust so thick it clung to your soul. On the edge of town, nestled behind a lean fence and a scatter of sunburned cottonwoods, lived a young woman named Josie Mercer. Her hands were calloused from work, her skin sun-kissed, and her heart fuller than most dared carry. She was the kind of woman who packed her hope between the folds of her apron and faced the day square on, no matter how crooked it got. Josie had been promised. 5 months back, Harold Bixby, the local blacksmith's son with a wide smile and a way of filling a room, had put a ring on her finger, a silver band hammered out of a horseshoe, which he said was lucky. "We'll marry come fall," he told her, and her cheeks had burned with a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. But then came Delilah Hart, a showy little thing from the railroad camps, with ringlets the color of chestnut and lips red as rose hips. She had the kind of walk that made men forget their manners and women cross themselves. By August, Harold stopped coming by Josie's porch. By September, he'd taken up with Delilah openly. And one morning, Josie heard from the preacher's wife that Harold and Delilah were bound for Kansas City, wedding bells already ringing somewhere far from Elhorn Ridge. Josie didn't cry. Not where anyone could see, anyhow. She just straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and kept on pouring coffee at the boarding house, kept on feeding chickens, kept on smiling through the burn. She thought that was the end of the story. A love lost, a lesson learned, and another year of dust and routine ahead. But fate, well, fate's a poker hand played slow. And on a golden September morning, just as the leaves began to rust at their edges and the wind carried the first sighs of autumn, a stranger rode into town. He wasn't much to look at from afar. Just another cowboy, tall, spare, with a hat that had seen better days and a coat dusted in the road's memory. His horse was gray with a limp, his boots scuffed to silence. But when he passed the general store, Miss Hattie nearly dropped her crate of apples. "Who is that?" she whispered to the baker's boy. He didn't know. No one did. Josie saw him first at the pump outside the mercantile. He tipped his hat as she passed, and she nodded politely. But something in the way he looked at her, like he saw not the tired dress or the ringless finger, but the fire that still lived in her bones, made her stop cold. Later that day, he came into the boarding house looking for a room. Name was Silas Cade. Paid in silver, not coin. Said he was just passing through, but folks always said that before the land sank claws and M. That night, Josie heard music drifting from the saloon, the old piano dusted off for the first time in weeks. A tune slow and sorrowful. Silas sat in the corner, hat low, watching the room like he was studying the past written on its walls. He didn't ask about her, didn't pry. But when Josie brought him stew and bread, he smiled with something real behind it. "You ever think some endings ain't endings at all?" he asked, not looking up. She didn't answer, but her hands trembled when she took the bowl back. Outside, the first cold wind of fall whispered down the main street. And Josie Mercer, abandoned, heart-worn, but far from finished, felt the story turning again. Silas Cade stayed on at the boarding house longer than most thought he would. Claimed he was waiting on a letter from a cousin in Deadwood. But Josie figured he was waiting on something else entirely, though she couldn't say what. Mornings, he'd sit out front with a tin cup of coffee, boots crossed at the ankle, gazing at the town like it was some faraway battlefield. Didn't talk much unless he had to. But when he did, folks listened. Not because he was loud, quite the opposite. His voice was low, sanded down like a river stone, but there was steel in it. Old kind of steel, forged in hardship. Josie watched him without meaning to. Saw the way he'd tip his hat to widows, step off the boardwalk to let others pass. How he gave the stable boy his own gloves one cold morning without a word. That's the kind of man he was. Worn, maybe, but whole where it counted. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the chapel and painted the world in firelight, Silas came into the kitchen while Josie was scrubbing pans. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You got a minute?" he asked. She turned, cautious. "Depends what you're skinned." Silas tilted his head toward the back porch. "Just want to show you something." Josie wiped her hands, followed him out where the dusk hung thick. He pointed toward the hills beyond town. You see that notch in the ridge there? She nodded. Old cavalry camp way back. My brother died up there, buried beneath a lone juniper. I come through every year, leave a stone for him. Josie looked at him, eyes narrowing. And you're telling me this why? Silas shrugged. Figure you look like someone who don't like to forget. The silence stretched between them. Finally she spoke. You see me clearly, mister. Not many do. Not many try, he said. They stood there a long while, saying nothing more, just watching the wind stir the cottonwoods and the sky roll toward night. The next morning, word buzzed through town like hornets in a tin can. Harold Bixby was coming back. Delilah had run off with a traveling gambler out of Dodge, left him broke and bruised. Folks were torn between Logan and pitying him. Josie just stared into her coffee. The pain she thought buried deep stirred in her chest, like coals roused by wind. Later that day, Harold did indeed show his sorry face. Walked into town with his hat in hand, shoulders slumped like a man carrying the weight of his own foolishness. He headed straight for the boarding house, like a dog begging scraps. Josie met him on the porch. Her apron was damp, her eyes sharp. Josie, he said, voice low and tight. I made a mistake. Delilah, she weren't what I thought. But you. I see now what I gave up. She let the silence stretch so long. Harold started to fidget. Then, calm as anything, she said, You gave up more than me, Harold. You gave up the right to come back. He stammered, tried to speak, but Josie turned and shut the door behind her. Left him out there with the dust and his regrets. Inside, Silas stood just beyond the stairs, a hammer looped through his belt. He'd been fixing the back door again. Man was always mending things. You all right? He asked. Josie nodded. Better than I thought I'd be. Silas studied her a moment, then gave a soft grunt. Good. A woman like you, strong, kind, deserves better than that kind of man. Josie gave him a tired smile. Funny thing, I thought that once too. That night, as the lanterns flickered and the town exhaled another long breath of prairie life, Silas pulled out a small, leather-bound book and began to write by the hearth. Josie, passing with a basket of linens, glanced over his shoulder. What are you writing? He looked up, eyes crinkling at the corners. Just names. Places I've been. Promises I've kept. You keep many. Silas paused, looked her straight in the eye. Only the ones that matter. And in that moment, Josie Mercer felt a stirring in her heart she hadn't felt since she first tried on a wedding dress she never got to wear. October came down hard on Elhorn Ridge, with winds that scratched at the windows and painted the leaves in fire. The corn dried in the fields, brittle and rattling like old bones. Folks began bringing in wood, patching roofs, and speaking in shorter sentences. That's how fall was out west. No time for wasted words when winter's breath was getting close. Silas Cade, for all his quiet and strange ways, had worked his way into the bones of the town, helped fix the chapel roof, broke up a fight outside the saloon without drawing iron, even taught young Will McGraw how to tie a better hitch knot. He still didn't say much, but folks had started nodding to him with respect. Not friendship, mind you, but recognition, like the way one might acknowledge a wild animal that had decided not to bite. Josie found herself listening for his boots on the floorboards, noticing when he didn't show up to supper, and catching herself smiling when he did. She hated herself a little for it, not because of Silas, but because it meant she was letting down that wall she'd built after Harold, stone by stone. One Saturday, as clouds rolled in over the western ridge, and the smell of rain clung to the air, Josie found Silas sitting on the back stoop, whittling a piece of cedar. "What are you making?" she asked. He held up the shape. Looked like the beginnings of a horse. "Don't know yet," he said. "Sometimes I just start carving. See what comes out." She sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his coat, but not so close that it'd start tongues wagging. "You ever think of staying?" she asked quietly. He paused. The wind tugged at his hat brim. "Sometimes," he said, "but my past's got long arms." Before Josie could ask more, a shout rang out from the front. Bootsteps thundered across the porch. Silas Cade, you no good traitor. Come out and face me. Josie stood, her heart jumping. Silas didn't move right away. Just set down his carving, sighed long and low like a man used to this sort of storm, and rose. Outside stood a man in a blue coat dusted with road, a six-shooter low on his hip. He was lean, hard-eyed, and carried himself like someone who'd stared down more than his share of death. Name's Jasper Low. He spat. This man here deserted the Montana Rangers, took money, ran south, and left my brother to die at Dead Crow Pass. The crowd that had started gathering outside the boarding house gasped low. Josie stared at Silas. He didn't deny it, just stood there, jaw tight. I didn't desert, Silas said, his voice steady. I was ordered to pull back. Your brother stayed behind on his own. Coward's words. Jasper snarled. I tracked you near 3 years. I aim to finish this. Not here, Josie said suddenly, stepping forward. Not in this town. We don't need more ghosts walking these streets. Jasper ignored her, eyes locked on Silas. I won't draw on you, Low, Silas said. Then you'll die with your hands clean. He reached for his gun, but before the iron-cleared leather, a rifle cracked from the livery, wood splintered near Jasper's feet. The crowd screamed. Sheriff Enoch Boone lowered the rifle, his face like carved stone. That's enough, he said. You want justice. You ride to Cheyenne and bring a marshal. But you draw again in Elhorn Ridge, I'll bury you myself. Jasper spit in the dirt. Ain't over. Then he mounted his horse and rode off, his shadow long and mean in the dusk light. Josie turned to Silas. Is it true? He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was pain in them. Real pain. Yes. And with that, he walked back inside. The days after Jasper Low rode out were quieter, but not peaceful. Folks in town kept their distance, whispering over fence rails and behind feed sacks. Sheriff Boone didn't press charges, but he made it clear Silas was to keep his nose clean and his boots on local ground until he heard otherwise. Josie saw the change in Silas. He still did his chores, still nodded polite, but something behind his eyes had shifted, like a man waiting for thunder he knew was coming, and wondering if this time it'd strike him clean. One chilly October evening, Josie brought a pie out to the porch where he sat watching the horizon. Apple, she said, setting it down beside him. You look like you could use something warm. He looked at it, then at her. You trust me. She didn't answer right away, just eased down onto the step beside him, pulling her shawl tight. I don't know what happened up there at Dead Crow Pass. I ain't got the facts, but I seen you mend more than fences. I've seen how you carry weight, how you speak when you could stay silent. That tells me enough. He didn't say nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched like he might have smiled if he remembered how. As they sat, a wind kicked up from the south, scattering leaves across the dusty yard. Josie watched the sky. Feels like a storm's brewing. You ain't wrong, Silas said low. And sure enough, next day the news came from the stage driver. Jasper hadn't gone to Cheyenne. He'd gone to gather men. 5 of them. Hired guns from over in Devil's Basin. Said he'd be back come week's end. Sheriff Boone called a meeting. Half the town crammed into the chapel pews. Some called for Silas to leave, take the danger with him. Others said he'd earned his place, and they'd stand by him. Josie stood up in the middle of it, hands tight on the back of a pew. Y'all forgettin' who gave wood to the Dunlaps after their barn burned? Who stayed up 3 nights helpin' Doc Russell with that fevered baby? You think a guilty man would do that? Maybe to cover his sins, someone muttered. No, Josie snapped, eyes flashing. He didn't do those things to be seen. He did them because it's who he is. The chapel went quiet after that. That night, Silas came to her door, hat in hand. I can't let this town bleed for my past, he said. I'm leaving at first light. Josie stared at him, heart thudding like a freight wagon. You leave now, she said, voice trembling. You're proving them right. He stepped back like she'd slapped him. She followed him out onto the porch. You're not that man anymore. You said your past had long arms. Well, maybe it does. But if it's reaching, you stand and face it. He looked at her a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. When Friday came, the clouds hung low and heavy. 5 riders showed at the edge of town, Jasper and his hired guns, mean-eyed and riding with purpose. But they didn't find Silas alone. They found the town waiting. Sheriff Boone with a rifle, Doc Russell with a shotgun, Miss Hattie with a pitchfork, and Josie standing beside Silas, her jaw set like flint. Jasper reined in. "You got no cause to die for him," he barked. "No," Boone said. "But we got cause to live with ourselves. He stays." Jasper sneered. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Josie said, stepping forward. "But at least we're making it together." There was a pause then, long enough to hold a breath. Then Jasper backed down. He turned his horse, spat in the dirt, and rode off, the others following behind. The town held its breath till they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Silas turn to Josie. "You didn't have to stand with me," he said. "I know," she replied. "But maybe you ain't the only one with a past that's still reaching." And that night, under a sky painted with stars and the last breath of fall, he kissed her, not like a man borrowing a moment, but like one set in roots. After the standoff, life in Elhorn Ridge settled into a new rhythm, one built on respect, shared glances, and the kind of quiet that means something. The townsfolk still talked, folks always do, but the talk had changed. Silas Cade was no longer just a stranger who rode in on a gray horse. He was one of them now, blood-bonded by fear and loyalty. And Josie Mercer? Well, she walked straighter these days. There was pride in her step and a light in her eyes that hadn't been there since Harold left her in the dust. The leaves began to fall in earnest, swirling down like rust-colored promises. The boarding house porch got colder in the mornings, and folks started bringing out heavy coats and woolen scarves. But inside Josie, a warmth had taken root, a deep, slow-burning kind, the kind that don't vanish with the season. It was Sheriff Boone who said it first, one morning at the Mercantile. "You two gonna make it official or keep courting like teenagers?" Josie had nearly dropped her jar of molasses. Silas just smiled, slow and crooked. Later that night, by the fire behind the livery, Josie found herself looking up at him. "You ever been married?" she asked. Silas shook his head. "Closest I got was making a ring out of horsehair once when I was 20 and full of foolish notions." Josie chuckled. "What happened?" "She ran off with a gambler in Santa Fe. Said he had prettier boots." Josie leaned in, her shoulder brushing his. "Well, I reckon I prefer scuffed leather and steady hands." Silas went still for a beat. Then, quiet as wind in the canyon, he said, "I got no land to offer Josie. No house, no family name worth carrying. Just me, dust and all." She looked him full in the face. "That's all I want." 3 days later, Silas rode out at dawn. Didn't say where he was going. Just left a note on her nightstand. "Back in 2 days. Trust me." Josie didn't sleep that night. Didn't sleep the next one either. She told herself not to worry. Told herself he wasn't leaving. Not like Harold. But old wounds remember. Then, on the second evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the cottonwoods gold, Silas rode back into town. He carried a small pouch in his saddlebag. Said nothing to no one. Just tied off his horse, walked straight to Josie's porch, and dropped to one knee. "Now, I ain't got a preacher's flair or a poet's tongue," he said, holding out the pouch. "But I got this." Inside was a ring. Not gold, not silver. It was carved from bone, elk, smooth and pale, shaped by hand. A braid of Josie's own hair wrapped around the band, sealed beneath a fine glaze. At its center, a single turquoise bead. Josie gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't buy you a cathedral," he said, "but I can promise a roof, a fire, and a heart that won't wander." She knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "That's more than any vow I've ever heard." They kissed there on the porch, while dusk gathered around them and the sky turned the color of old honey. And somewhere deep in the hills, a coyote howled like he knew the world had just changed. The days that followed were a flurry of hand-sewn lace, borrowed flowers, and whispered plans, passed along like sacred secrets. Elhorn Ridge hadn't seen a wedding in over 3 years, not since young Hannah Boone married the blacksmith's boy and rode off east. But this time, it wasn't just a ceremony. It was a reckoning, a declaration. Josie Mercer, once left with a hollow ring and a bruised heart, was going to walk down that chapel aisle on her own 2 feet, and beside her would be a man not of riches or reputation, but of substance. The townsfolk pitched in like bees to a bloom. Miss Hattie hemmed the sleeves on Josie's mother's old wedding dress, soft ivory linen, faded with time but still strong. Sheriff Boone swept the chapel clean himself, muttering something about getting the dust off the Lord's doorstep. Doc Russell offered a bottle of aged rye for the celebration, and the mercantile boy, Jonah, cut wildflowers from the hill beyond town. Sunflowers and aster, bright against the cooling world. Silas didn't say much, but he worked hard. Built a small arbor from fence posts and old cedar, tied with strips of burlap and sprigs of dried sage. He smoothed his coat, polished his boots, and wrote out his vows longhand on a scrap of ledger paper. One sentence, just 12 words. Where you walk, I'll follow. Where you rest, I'll stay. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp. The air smelled of wood smoke and cider, and the sky stretched clear from rim to rim. Josie stood before her mirror, hands trembling slightly as she pinned her hair. Her reflection looked back at her not as a girl wronged, but as a woman reclaimed. Out by the chapel, folks gathered slow and quiet, like they knew they were witnessing more than vows. When Josie stepped into view, there was a hush. She didn't wear veils or pearls, just her mother's dress, a sprig of sage at her waist, and a look in her eye like thunder finally settling into rain. Silas stood at the altar, back straight, his hands clean but weathered. When he saw her, his breath caught, not like a man surprised, but like a man finally home. Reverend Cole kept the ceremony short. "Ain't no need to speak what's already plain," he said, smiling. "These two folks don't need blessing. They've been walking through fire and came out whole." Silas slipped the bone-in turquoise ring on her finger. Josie whispered her own vow, voice steady. "Wherever we go together." And with that, the two of them kissed under the cedar arch, while the wind rustled the leaves like a soft applause. The townsfolk cheered, and someone struck up a fiddle near the porch. They danced on the chapel steps, on the packed dirt street, under lanterns that glowed like fallen stars. There weren't fine china or a silver platter, but there was laughter and music and more than a few tears. That night, as the fire dimmed and the last guests wandered home, Josie and Silas sat on the porch of the boarding house. "Now there's together." He pulled her close. "I never thought I'd find this," he murmured. Josie smiled into his shoulder. "That makes 2 of us." And above them, the stars blinked quiet-like, as if even heaven was content to let them be. Winter came slow to Elhorn Ridge that year, like it knew better than to interrupt. The air turned crisp, the first snow dusted the porch rail, and the world quieted around Josie and Silas Cade. They settled into life, like 2 pieces long meant to fit. Mornings brought the smell of coffee and wood smoke, boots beside the door, and letters half written on the kitchen table. Silas took to mending things, gates, boots, even a few broken hearts around town. Josie kept her hands busy with cooking and tending a garden that never did much but gave her peace. But peace ain't the same as stillness. One morning, Sheriff Boone rode up with a telegram in hand, brows drawn low. "Marshal out of Cheyenne's been sniffing around," he said, voice heavy. "Seems Jasper Low didn't take kindly to being turned back. He's stirring things with his kin." Silas nodded, calm as always. "Let him stir." Josie watched the 2 men. Her heart clenched, but she said nothing. Not yet. That night, Silas sat at the window, polishing his revolver. It hadn't seen much use in Elhorn Ridge, but a man don't forget how to keep his tools ready. Josie sat beside him, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea. "You think it's coming?" she asked. Silas didn't answer right off. "Then maybe. But I ain't running, not this time." She reached for his hand. "You're not alone anymore. We fight or we flee. We do it together." 2 days later, the riders came. 3 of 'em, one with a tin star he must have bought at a pawn shop, and a mean way of looking. They rode straight into town, slow and sure, like wolves smelling a weakness. Silas stepped out to meet them before they made it to the saloon. "You Silas Cade?" the self-declared marshal barked. "I am. Got a warrant here says you're wanted for desertion, and that you resisted lawful arrest." Silas didn't blink. "That's so." Before the man could reach for his sidearm, Josie stepped out behind Silas, rifle in hand, barrel steady, her voice low and clear. "This town says otherwise." One by one, doors opened. Sheriff Boone, Miss Hattie, Doc Russell, even little Jonah, with a pitchfork and wide eyes. The men looked around, read the air, and made the same decision Jasper Low had. They turned and rode. That night, Josie and Silas sat out back, a fire crackling low. "You think that's the end of it?" she asked. "Maybe not," he said, arm around her shoulder. "But the next time it ain't. I'll still be standing. And now, I got someone standing with me." She leaned into him. "We built something here, Silas. Ain't much, but it's ours." He kissed her temple, and they watched the stars come out, quiet and clear. In the end, Josie didn't get the wedding she thought she wanted. She got the one she deserved, not dressed in lace and gold, but in grit and grace, under a sky too wide to cage, and beside a man who knew what it meant to choose her, even when the whole world said to run. And that, partner, is a love story strong enough to weather any wind.